Okay, good afternoon. Hope you found some lunch, or at least could grab some lunch from somewhere else if you didn't find lunch yourself. We're back in the third session already for this EBC Thesis event edition 2016. And this afternoon we were going to listen to 4 talks. 3 of them are theses which were submitted already in June, and so Jesko, you're the first one that can open the floor. You have 12 to 15 minutes. I stop you at 15 minutes. You don't go over the 15 minutes, and preferably try to go to the 12 minutes.
Can you give me a sign at 40?
Yeah, for sure. I will, and then after that, it's time for discussion. So good luck with your presentation.
Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Jesko, and I would like to introduce my topic using reconstructed catch data to summarize studies and trends of island fisheries. I was greatly supervised by Guy Menezes and Eva Giacomello on the Azores. And to give you some background, I would like to talk a bit about islands and why it's interesting to look at their fisheries. So islands can be seen as some sort of biospheres in the otherwise rather homogeneous ocean. And they can be sitting on the continental shelf, but they can also be oceanic, meaning they're in the middle of the ocean, usually by volcanic origin. They're more vulnerable than mainland countries in many aspects, such as natural extreme events. And as any coastal country, they're surrounded by the EEZ, which is the exclusive economic zone. Usually it reaches out 200 nautical miles from the shoreline, and it gives the sovereign right to the country to extract resources within this region. However, the EEZ for islands, especially oceanic islands, is often highly limited in terms of shallow water fish and rather restricted to pelagic or deep sea regimes because they have very steep slopes. So, recent status and trends of island fisheries have, to our best knowledge, not yet been summarized. We have this for a global compilation of countries, for all around the world, but not specifically for islands. So this is leading us to the aims, which are to explore island fisheries, how much is caught, what is caught, who is fishing where, etc. In the second part, we also want to see if species composition of the catch, hence catch composition, is rather based on oceans, that is the Indian Ocean, Atlantic and Pacific, or if it's rather different between climate regions, that is north, tropical and south. And finally, we also want to look at socio-economic factors and see if we can use them to explain some of the trends we found in the fisheries. So, to explain you a bit about the database I used, I want to go back to the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations, which is sending out reports every year to all its member states to collect data of their fisheries. But as this already implies, this is only reported data. But there's also unreported data, such as discards. And this is being reconstructed by the Sea Around Us project, based at the University of British Colombia. So we mainly use the Sea Around Us database for our fisheries data, but there's also another database, which is the World Bank database. The World Bank database contains the socio-economic data we want to use. And we use this for an overlapping time period from 1960 to 2010. So we ended up with the fisheries data and the socio-economic data, and we filtered it for island nations. Those island nations are spread all around the world in the major oceans, and we ended up with 74 rather small and rather independent island nations. The first result we got was the sum of catches per year. And here it's divided into the fishery sectors, where we have the subsistence fishing, which is fishing to sustain yourself, artisanal fishing, which is small-scale commercial fishing, and recreational fishing, which is fishing to enjoy yourself when you go out on a Sunday to fish your fish. And we can see that when we look at the subsistence fishing in relation to artisanal fishing, subsistence fishing is quite strong on the island nations compared to the global trend. The recreational fishing is very small, which basically matches the global trend. But if you look at this picture, you can already see that there's one sector missing, which is industrial fishing. So if we include industrial fishing, we can see that it makes up 80% in 2010. And despite its high variabilities over time, it's definitely increasing. So if we look at this graph as it is, the sum of catches, but not dividing it into sectors, fishery sectors, but into catch composition, we can see that the blue one here, the tuna fisheries, starts with a very small contribution and ends up with about 40% of the total catch in 2010. Also interesting is that we found tuna fisheries on 71 out of 74 islands. Then we have the cod lights, they're going up, down, and very interesting, the herring here, in the 50s and in the 60s. They're mainly caught by Norway and mainly caught on the Faroe Islands. So to look closer at the Faroe Islands, I would like to show this graph, where we have the EEZ on the x-axis and the total sum of catch on the y-axis. The bubble size is the population size of the island. So we can see that by far the highest catches are made by the Faroe Islands and by the Falkland Islands, who have fairly small EEZs and very small population size. So I was asking myself, why is it like this? And finally, we excluded foreign fishing. And what we can see is that the Faroe Islands dropped from 25 million tons down to not even 1/3, and the Falkland Islands completely disappear from the picture. So, who is actually fishing most on foreign islands? And first of all, we found Norway, basically due to the herring fisheries in the 50s and 60s, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and still unknown fishing country. So there are still many boats out there where we don't even know where they come from. In general, we have to say that around 60% of the catch is made by foreign entities, and that they peaked off at 70% in the 50s. So I would just like to quickly talk about the catch composition. Here we found that in a permanova there were significant differences in catch composition and species composition of the catch between oceans and between climate regions. But if you look at the principal coordinate analysis here, you can already see that the points are rather overlapping for oceans and rather cloudy for the climate regions. So that already shows you that the climate region is the stronger factor to explain different catch composition on islands. And that basically makes sense if you consider the different temperature ranges fish species have, where they can live. So, just for one slide, I would like to forget about fisheries and just talk about the socio-economics. We have the gross domestic product, GDP, which is usually used to indicate the wealth of a country. So that basically matches the global trend. It's even slightly higher for islands. Similar for life expectancy, leveling off at about 70 years, also slightly higher than the global trend. Population density, as we know, is dramatically increasing on Earth. But if we look at the actual numbers, we can see that we have 300 people per square kilometer. And that is about 6 times the global average of 50 people per square kilometer. So islands are very densely populated. And the rural population, as we know, we have a global trend of urbanization. So on islands with about 50% of the people living in cities. So now I would like to try to combine the socioeconomics to the fishery data we found. And for that we have the degrees of industrial fishing here, the level low, medium and high. And we have 95% confidence intervals. So for the GDP you can already see that we have a very weak trend. But there is a very weak trend of higher GDPs on islands where we also have higher degrees of industrial fishing. Similar for the rural population, again, very weak trend, but there's a trend of higher industrialization on islands with high rural population percentage. A bit more interesting is the population size, where we can see that islands that are that have high degrees of industrial fishing have very small population sizes. And that, to me, makes some kind of sense if you consider that we are mainly talking about foreign fishing, where they need actually access agreements to the EEZ of an island, and that access agreement might be easier to get if you have very little stakeholder pressure and very little public awareness. So that's usually remote islands. So I would like to conclude that island fisheries are governed by industrial fishing. Tuna industry is almost omnipresent, so it's almost on every island. Small island with small population sizes can be highly exploited. Governance by foreign countries is led by Norway and Japan. And there's a tendency of higher industrialization on islands with low population size. So as an outlook, I think industrial fishing should be more in a management focus. Even though it might be hard to manage sometimes because we are talking about big boats that sometimes don't even come to shore within the EEZ, but it's the main part of the fisheries. And other islands might follow Palau, which is a small island group in the Pacific that completely banned commercial fishing from its EEZ. So by that, it's not only protecting its pristine environments, but it's also protecting its dive tourism industry, which is basically much more money in terms of economic growth compared to the fisheries sector. And of course, we are mainly talking about foreign fishing, so there's a global approach needed. Basically laws, law enforcement, and consumer choices. Meaning try to avoid frozen fish in the supermarket, try to buy local fish. And as an outlook in terms of research, I think that especially the population size and degree in combination with the degrees of industrial fishing would be interesting to further analyze. Especially if you would use some sort of time series correlation where you have the socio-economic data and the fisheries data over time. Since we are only working within the scope of a thesis, we were summing up the catches to try to find trends in very little time by looking at many different things. So yes, that's my outlook, and now I thank you for your attention and I encourage you to ask questions.
Questions? Come on.
So I have read your text. I look at it and it's a very nice job, but why you conclude that you should do a time series correlation where you have the time series? That's what I was asking. So you can have done it actually.
Yes, but also you have to see that we only showed in the thesis a very little part of what we actually did. So we just summed up all the things we had, and then we put it in primer, and we were exploring many things. So in the end, we only picked the things that were interesting. But in the time series correlation, I already had the script in R. But in the end, we concluded that it's easier to make it in primer, and then do further time series correlation when we have more time.
I had many questions, but I will ask you just very few of them. I find that the diagram you put with the EEZ surface and the catch, very interesting, but also it shows that there is a lot of dispersions of all the data over all possibilities, I should say.
You're talking about the graph I showed?
Yes,
the population?
Yeah. And so I was wondering if it was it's a good criteria, but it doesn't give you any particularities or any trend.
Yeah.
So how would you explain this absence of trend actually?
Well, this plot was only meant to get an overview. because we had no idea what it looks like, we had no idea what the distribution is like. So I just came to the idea, okay, we can plot the EZ size, the population size, and the catch, and then see if there are some outliers. It was not meant to analyze anything in detail.
And did you try to look at some points, what was the status of the island and compared to the regulation of the country?
The regulations we didn't include, because that's very complex sometimes. You have the national, then you have regional laws, then you have management plans that go for species, like the tuna fisheries, for example, they're regulated all over the Atlantic, so that's very complex.
Another question that I find in it is that you have the species that are harvested by the industry are usually not the same as the species for subsistence and even for artisanal fishery. So
yes.
How can you split them to analyze more finely what is really the exploitation of the local island fisheries, I should say?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you can already look at the regimes. If you have pelagic regimes, or if you're looking at, for example, cod lakes. Because the tuna fishery, for example, we know that it's highly industrialized. And that's already 40% of the total catch. And 50% of that is only one species, which is Katsuwonus, pelamis, the skipjack tuna. So we know that this is highly industrialized. And I guess like the invertebrates, for example, and some other fish, sometimes they are only grouped because we don't know what fish they actually catch. Especially in the subsistence sector, for example, we don't really know what they catch. We just know they catch roughly this amount of invertebrates, for example.
And my last question is, I know some examples of islands that, like Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, for example, and because it's a particular case that when you compare to the gross product, it's difficult to have a vision of the local of the island and the regional economic activity. So most of the fisheries are depending on the regional economic activity, I should say, not necessarily the island. How you will take this account, I did not really understand.
You mean the different regions within
yes.
the island?
Yeah.
Well, here we could only look at countries, so nations, because we are using the World Bank database, and they only have countries that have own country codes. So that was one of the filters we had to apply. But yes, it's true. For example, on the Fiji Islands, usually when you look at case studies, they look at 5, 6 islands, but of course Fiji Islands have many, many islands.
Okay, so you did not
No, we couldn't look at regional trends.
Questions? Yeah. Jesko, I'm wondering about the economics of this foreign industrial fishing. Which is the common way, how they come to an agreement with the island? What are the people from the island given in exchange of granting access for foreign fishing?
Yes. In terms of this, usually it's highly connected to corruption. I think we have to say it like this. There's also a paper saying that it's really a problem that there's so much corruption, especially in politics, because there are few people who make the access agreements with big companies from Japan, Taiwan, and we already know that before we had the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982, there was no EEZ before, really. And everyone could fish everywhere until we decided, okay, we want an EEZ of 200 nautical miles, and only the country who is within this EEZ is allowed to fish there, except if you have an access agreement. But for Pacific Islands, for example, it was found that after the establishment of the EEZ, they didn't really profit from this. So the people were just keep fishing. Of course, we have high illegal activities, especially in the industrial sector, but also the access agreements were not fair. They get a little bit of money, which is a lot for some persons that might make those access agreements, but in total for the economy of the island, it's usually a loss, especially for the tourism sector.
I've seen that you somehow measured or determined the degree to which an island has its own industrial fleet. you know that in your study at least, you show that some islands do have industrial fishing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Have you investigated the reasons or what favors the appearance of industrial fishing? Because I guess it has to do with relativity and population size, no?
Well, yeah, I don't know. It can also be regulations. For example, on the Azores, where they said we don't want any bottom trawling anymore, and they don't do it anymore. And also it depends on the enforcement, of course. I was talking about Palau, that they were banning their commercial fishing from the EEZ because they decided that it's a long-term loss, but they only have one boat to enforce their law. So in the end, we're gonna go back to the illegal activities.
Time for one small question from the audience. This has been a very clear talk. Thank you for the... Time to give your appreciation to the talk.